The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Judge Elizabeth Carter adjusted her robe and glanced over her glasses at the defendant standing before her. She tapped her pen against the desk, eyes scanning the file in front of her before letting out an exaggerated sigh. The corners of her mouth curled into a smirk as she leaned forward. "Mr. Jameson, is it?" Her voice dripped with condescension. "Yet again, you find yourself in my courtroom. What is it this time? Another traffic violation? Or perhaps you've graduated to something more serious?" The man standing before her, Darnell Jameson, remained composed, his sharp brown eyes locked onto hers. He was tall, well-dressed in a charcoal suit, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. There was no fear in his stance, no desperation, just patience. Judge Carter scoffed. "Well, let's see here. You were pulled over for a broken taillight, and then, oh, what a surprise, resisted arrest. Let me guess, you told the officer you didn't do anything wrong, right?" A few quiet chuckles echoed from the jury box. The judge grinned, satisfied with the reaction. Darnell took a breath, but did not speak. "Oh, don't go all silent on me now," Judge Carter continued. "You people always have something to say. Go ahead, enlighten me." The room fell into an awkward silence. Darnell's attorney, a young woman named Rachel Myers, clenched her jaw but remained seated. She had warned him about this judge, known for her sharp tongue, harsher sentences, and obvious disdain for certain defendants. "Your Honor," Darnell finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I believe in justice. That's why I'm standing here today. But I also believe in truth. And the truth is I did nothing wrong." Judge Carter chuckled, shaking her head. Of course. It's never your fault, is it? Well, let's see if your story holds up, shall we?" She motioned for the prosecutor to proceed. The case was flimsy. The officer's body cam footage mysteriously cut out just before the alleged resisting arrest took place. The prosecution relied solely on the officer's testimony, but the details were inconsistent. Rachel argued brilliantly, poking holes in their claims, but Judge Carter wasn't interested in logic. She yawned dramatically. "I think I've heard enough," she announced before the defense could finish. "Mr. Jameson, you've wasted enough of this court's time. It's clear to me that you have no respect for the law, and quite frankly, neither does your attorney with the way she's defending such nonsense. Therefore, I have no choice but to." The door to the courtroom burst open. All eyes turned. A man in a dark suit, his face grim, strode into the room. A second later, 2 uniformed officers followed, their expressions unreadable. Judge Carter's smirk faltered. "Your Honor," the man said, pulling a badge from his pocket. "I'm U.S. Attorney Greg Pearson. We need to speak with you. Now." Her fingers twitched against the gavel. "Can't this wait? We're in the middle of a case." "I'm afraid it can't," Pearson replied. "It's about you." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Darnell didn't move, but a flicker of something unreadable passed over his face. Judge Carter huffed, clearly irritated. "Excuse me? If this is some kind of joke." "It's not a joke," Pearson cut in. "We have reason to believe you've been engaged in judicial misconduct, including racially biased sentencing," and he hesitated for effect, "accepting bribes to ensure harsher sentences for minority defendants." A sharp intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Rachel's eyes widened, and for the first time, the usually smug judge looked caught off guard. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, though her voice wasn't as steady as before. "I demand to know what." "Judge Carter," Pearson interrupted, "I suggest you come with us. We have evidence, recorded conversations, financial records, and witness testimonies." His voice darkened. "You're under investigation." A stunned silence settled over the room. The bailiff, hesitant, looked between Pearson and the judge. Carter forced a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You must be joking. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I am Judge Elizabeth Carter. You can't just barge in here with baseless accusations." Pearson nodded at the officers. "Escort her out." The judge's face twisted in rage as the officers approached. "You have no right." "I will not." But she was cut off as they flanked her, one gripping her elbow. She jerked her arm away. "Get your hands off me." Rachel leaned back in her seat, watching as Judge Carter's smug demeanor crumbled into panic. "You have no idea what you're doing," the judge shrieked, struggling against their grip. "This is absurd. I will have your jobs for this." But Pearson wasn't listening. He had already turned to Darnell. "Mr. Jameson," he said, his voice calm, "on behalf of the Justice Department, I apologize for what you've been through. This case should never have been brought to trial. You are free to go." Darnell met his gaze, nodding once. No gloating. No satisfaction. Just quiet dignity. Judge Carter, meanwhile, was still fighting. "This is a mistake. You can't." Pearson looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Ironic, isn't it?" he mused. "You laughed at the idea of justice just minutes ago. But now, it's justice that's coming for you." And as she was dragged from the courtroom, her screams echoing through the halls, the gavel, once her weapon, lay untouched on the bench, powerless. Judge Elizabeth Carter's once commanding voice had turned into shrill, desperate protests as the officers escorted her out of the courtroom. The audience, still in shock, remained silent, their eyes fixed on the disgraced judge who had spent years handing out sentences with arrogance and cruelty. The murmurs started low, but grew in intensity, a wave of hushed disbelief and quiet satisfaction rippling through the room. Some exchanged glances, others whispered to their neighbors, but no one dared to move until the heavy doors slammed shut behind her. Darnell Jameson stood still, his face unreadable, though something in his eyes flickered. Perhaps relief, perhaps something deeper. Rachel Myers, his attorney, let out a slow breath, gripping the table in front of her as if steadying herself. The moment felt surreal. The courtroom, which had always felt like enemy territory, suddenly felt different, lighter, freer. The weight of systemic injustice had not lifted entirely, but today, a small crack had formed in the foundation of corruption. U.S. Attorney Greg Pearson, still standing tall in his dark suit, cleared his throat, regaining the attention of the room. "This court is now adjourned," he said firmly, though it was clear his authority was no longer needed. The case had already been decided, not by the judge, but by the truth that had finally caught up to her. The bailiff hesitated for a moment. Then, as if remembering his duty, turned to Darnell. "You're free to go, sir," he said, almost reluctantly. The same man who would have forced him into shackles minutes ago now had no choice but to acknowledge his innocence. Darnell turned to Rachel. "Let's get out of here." His voice was low, steady, but Rachel could sense the storm beneath his calm exterior. She nodded, grabbing her briefcase, and together they walked past the prosecution, past the jury, past the people who had assumed they knew the outcome before the trial even began. They walked out of the courtroom, not as a defeated man and his lawyer, but as victors in a battle that was never meant to be won. Darnell stopped walking. The cameras pressed closer, the reporters sensing an opportunity. Rachel put a protective hand on his arm, ready to pull him away, but he gently shook his head. He looked at the sea of microphones, at the faces waiting for a reaction, for anger, for an outburst. Instead, he simply said, "This isn't about me. This is about something bigger than one case. One trial. One man. We all saw what happened today, but the question is, will we remember it tomorrow?" With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the reporters scrambling to analyze his words, to twist them into something more sensational. But Rachel understood. Today wasn't just about his freedom. It was about the system that had failed him and so many others. It was about exposing a truth that people had long ignored. They reached Rachel's car, the courthouse still a chaotic blur behind them. She unlocked the door, sliding into the driver's seat while Darnell settled in beside her. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Rachel finally spoke. "You should be celebrating. This was a huge win." Darnell let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "A win." He turned to her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "Rachel, I lost months of my life. My name was dragged through the mud. People looked at me like I was guilty before I even spoke a word. That judge, she wasn't the only one. There are others just like her, doing the same thing every day, getting away with it. And for every person like me who walks free, there are 100 others still trapped." Rachel swallowed. He was right. This was one battle in a war that stretched far beyond this case. "So what now?" she asked. Darnell stared out the window, his fingers tapping against his leg. "Now," he exhaled. "Now I make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Meanwhile, in the depths of the courthouse, Judge Elizabeth Carter sat in a holding cell, her hands clenched into fists. The fluorescent light flickered above her, casting harsh shadows against the gray walls. Her once pristine robe had been confiscated, replaced with a plain jumpsuit that felt foreign against her skin. She had spent years sitting on the other side of the courtroom, passing judgment with a flick of her gavel. Now, she was the one waiting, powerless, trapped in a system she had manipulated for years. She replayed the events in her mind, her anger burning hotter with every passing second. How had this happened? She had been untouchable, respected, feared. Yet now, she was nothing more than another disgraced public figure, a headline on the evening news. A guard approached her cell, his expression neutral. "You have a visitor." She straightened, forcing herself into the poised posture she had perfected over the years. "Who?" The door opened, and Greg Pearson stepped inside. His gaze was steady, unreadable. He took his time, studying her as if she were an exhibit on display. Finally, he spoke. "You never thought this day would come, did you?" Judge Carter scoffed, leaning back against the bench. "This is a mistake. I will fight this." Pearson's lips twitched in something that might have been amusement. "You can try. But we have everything we need. Witnesses, financial records, conversations you thought were private. The walls are closing in, Your Honor." He let the last words linger, letting the irony sink in. Carter's mask of confidence cracked for just a moment before she forced it back into place. "And what do you want?" "To gloat." Pearson shook his head. "No. I want you to understand something. The people you sentenced unfairly, the ones you laughed at, the ones you saw as beneath you, they remember. And now the world sees you for what you really are." She narrowed her eyes. "You think this changes anything? There will always be another judge, another prosecutor, another system in place." Pearson sighed. "Maybe. But every time one of you falls, it makes room for something better." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Enjoy your time here, Judge Carter. You might find it's not so different from the world you created for others." As the door slammed shut for the first time in her life, Elizabeth Carter felt something she had never truly understood: fear. Elizabeth Carter sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, her fingers gripping the edge of the metal bench beneath her. Fear gnawed at her insides, an unfamiliar sensation that left a bitter taste in her mouth. The rhythmic dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere in the distance was the only sound that filled the silence, each drop echoing in her ears like a taunting reminder of her downfall. She had spent her entire career dictating the fates of others, reveling in the power that came with the gavel in her hand. But now she was on the other side, stripped of her authority, her pristine reputation reduced to nothing more than a scandalous headline flashing across television screens. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, for a loophole in the system she had once manipulated so effortlessly. There had to be a way to turn this around. She wasn't just any judge. She was Elizabeth Carter, the untouchable force of the courtroom, the woman who had sent countless men and women to prison without a second thought. This couldn't be the end of her legacy. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes. Then she heard it, the unmistakable click of a lock being turned. Her eyes snapped open as the door to her cell creaked open, revealing a guard standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made her uneasy. "You have another visitor," he said flatly. She straightened, forcing her expression into one of composed indifference, though her hands trembled slightly as she pushed herself to her feet. "Who is it?" she demanded, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. The guard stepped aside, and a familiar figure strode into the room, Darnell Jameson. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, years of injustice wrapped up in a single, heavy stare. Elizabeth felt her stomach twist. Seeing him standing there, free, while she was caged like an animal, was a cruel irony she had never thought possible. Darnell took a slow step forward, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He studied her, his gaze unreadable. Then he let out a slow, deliberate chuckle, one that sent a shiver down her spine. "You know," he said, tilting his head slightly, "if someone had told me a year ago that I'd see you in a jail cell, I would have laughed in their face." Elizabeth lifted her chin, her old arrogance flickering back to life. "Enjoy your little victory while it lasts," she snapped. "This isn't over." Darnell raised an eyebrow. "No, because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn over." He took another step closer. "You spent years sitting on that bench, acting like you were above everyone else. You laughed in my face, humiliated me, and sentenced me for a crime I didn't commit. But the difference between us, Judge Carter, is that I walked into this courthouse as an innocent man. You walked in guilty, and now the whole world knows it." Elizabeth clenched her jaw. "You think this changes anything? The system is bigger than you, bigger than me. One judge goes down, another takes their place. You think you've won something here, Jameson? You're still a black man in America. You'll always be fighting against people like me." Darnell exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Maybe," he admitted. "But today, people like you lost. And tomorrow, another one of you will fall. And the day after that, another. Change doesn't happen overnight, Carter, but it happens." He paused, then took one final step closer, his voice dropping lower. "I want you to remember this moment. Because no matter what happens next, no matter how much you fight it, you will never sit on that bench again. Your legacy is gone. Your power is gone. And the people you stepped on to climb your way to the top, they're the ones watching you fall." Elizabeth's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she had no defense, no sharp retort, no clever manipulation to twist the narrative in her favor. Darnell turned, heading for the door, but just before he stepped out, he glanced back at her one last time. "Enjoy your time in here, Judge Carter," he said quietly. "I hear the justice system isn't too kind to people like you." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Elizabeth standing alone in the middle of her cell, her body rigid, her mind spinning. The days that followed were a blur. She was formally charged with corruption, bribery, and a slew of other offenses that only seemed to pile up with each new witness that came forward. Every news station ran the story on an endless loop. Disgraced Judge Elizabeth Carter faces justice, her once respected face plastered across screens as talking heads debated the depths of her corruption. Prosecutors wasted no time building their case against her, and the irony of sitting in the defendant's chair, the same chair she had forced so many into, was not lost on her. The trial was swift. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The financial records, the testimonies, the secretly recorded conversations. It all painted a picture of a woman who had wielded her power with cruelty and arrogance, believing herself above the very laws she upheld. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty. Elizabeth Carter was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The moment the judge read the sentence aloud, the weight of it finally hit her. This was real. This was happening. She was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her once pristine suit wrinkled, her hair disheveled, her face pale and emotionless. The reporters were waiting for her outside, their cameras flashing wildly, capturing every second of her downfall. And in the crowd, standing silently, was Darnell Jameson. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments. Elizabeth wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, but she couldn't. He held her gaze, his expression unreadable, and then, slowly, he nodded. Not in triumph, not in gloating satisfaction, but in finality. This was the end. The prison walls were nothing like the grand halls of the courthouse. The moment Elizabeth stepped inside, she knew there was no escaping this reality. The other inmates watched her with sharp, knowing eyes. Some recognized her. Some had been sentenced by her. She had laughed at them once, mocked them, treated them like they were beneath her. Now she was one of them. And as she sat in her cold, metal bunk that night, staring up at the ceiling, she realized something that made her stomach twist into knots. She wasn't afraid of prison. She wasn't afraid of the bars or the locked doors or even the other inmates. She was afraid of the silence. Because, for the first time in her life, there was no gavel to slam, no courtroom to command, no power to wield. There was only the sound of her own breathing. And in that silence, she finally understood what it meant to be truly powerless.